The wind across the Wyoming plains in the winter of 1878 was not merely a sound. It was a physical presence, a relentless beast that clawed at the seams of the small, solitary cabin and howled with the hunger of 1,000 starving wolves. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in driving, horizontal sheets, burying the world under a shroud of blinding white. It erased roads, smothered fences, and sculpted the familiar landscape into a series of alien drifts and treacherous hollows. For the creatures of this land, it was a time of brutal reckoning. A deer, weakened by hunger, would be brought down by a pack of coyotes whose yips and cries carried for miles on the frozen air. A lone rabbit, its tracks a momentary flaw in the pristine snow, would vanish in a silent explosion of feathers as an owl descended from a barren cottonwood. And for man, the struggle was no less primal. The cold was a constant thief, stealing warmth from the flesh, strength from the limbs, and hope from the heart. Hunger was its shadow, a gnawing emptiness that made the thought of the coming spring feel like a distant, half-forgotten dream. In the heart of this unforgiving wilderness stood Eli's ranch. It was less a ranch now, and more a monument to a life that had ceased to be. The main barn, once filled with the scent of hay and the lowing of cattle, stood silent. The corrals were empty. Only a small, sturdy cabin, a woodshed, and a small outbuilding for his one remaining horse and a pair of milk goats testified to any human presence. Here, Eli lived alone. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the land itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, his movements were deliberate, economical, stripped of all wasted effort. His face was a map of past hardships, the lines around his eyes and mouth etched not by laughter but by squinting into sun and blizzard, by the clenching of his jaw against pain. His eyes, the pale gray of a winter sky just before a storm, held a stillness that could be mistaken for peace, but was, in truth, a profound and desolate emptiness. 10 years had passed since the fire. 10 years since the night a knocked-over lantern had turned his home into a roaring pyre, consuming his wife, Sarah, and their 6-year-old son, Thomas, in its insatiable hunger. Eli had been out in the barn, tending to a sick calf, and had returned to a vision of hell. He had tried to run in, his hands blistering on the hot wood of the doorframe, his lungs filling with black, choking smoke. But the heat had thrown him back, a monstrous, invisible hand. He had been left with nothing but the roaring in his ears, the smell of burnt pine and something sickeningly sweet, and the silence that came after. The fire had not only taken his family, it had burned away the part of him that knew how to feel. The grief had been a maelstrom at first, a wild, violent thing that had made him smash his fists against trees until they were bloody and raw. But over the years, it had frozen over, leaving behind a cold, hard permafrost in his soul. He had fought in the war, seen men torn apart by cannon fire and ravaged by disease. But that was the impersonal cruelty of the world. This was different. This was personal. Love, he had concluded, was a trap. It was a warm hearth that invited you in only to collapse and bury you in its embers. He had made a vow to the silent, snow-covered graves on the hill behind the cabin. Never again. He would not build something just to watch it burn. His heart was a locked and bolted door, and he had long since thrown away the key. His days were a ritual of survival. He rose before the sun, the cold of the cabin floor biting at his bare feet. He would light the fire in the stone hearth, his movements practiced and sure. He would tend to his animals, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He would chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, the only conversation he held. He hunted when he had to, his aim as steady and cold as his heart. He ate his meals, usually a simple stew of salted meat and dried beans, standing by the hearth, staring into the flames that had once taken everything from him. He spoke to no one for weeks, sometimes months, on end. The solitude was his armor, the silence, his shield. One afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, blue shadows across the snow, Eli was splitting logs when he heard it. It was a sound that did not belong, a sharp, desperate cry, almost stolen by the wind. He paused, axe in hand, every sense on high alert. It could be a coyote caught in a trap, or the cry of a mountain lion. He scanned the vast, white expanse. His eyes narrowed. Then he saw it, a dark smudge against the endless white, moving unsteadily toward his cabin. A person. His first instinct was a surge of raw irritation. A visitor was a disruption, a complication he did not need or want. As the figure drew closer, he could see it was a woman, bundled in a threadbare coat and a shawl wrapped around her head. She stumbled through the deep snow, her progress agonizingly slow. He watched, his face an unreadable mask of stone, as she finally reached the relative shelter of his porch, her hand reaching out to brace herself against a post. He did not move from the woodshed. He simply waited. After a moment, she seemed to gather her strength and approached the cabin door, knocking weakly. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the silence he had so carefully cultivated. He set down his axe, his movement stiff with reluctance, and walked to the door, opening it just a crack. The woman who stood before him was perhaps in her late 40s, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her face was gaunt and chapped raw by the wind. Her eyes, a deep, tired brown, were filled with a desperate plea. She was shivering uncontrollably.
"Please, sir,"
she said, her voice a hoarse whisper.
"I need shelter. Just for the night. The storm. It's getting worse."
Eli's gaze was cold, flat, and unforgiving. "Keep moving. There's a town, 2 days' ride east."
"I won't make it,"
she said, her voice cracking.
"My horse gave out a mile back. I have nothing."
"That's not my concern," he stated, his voice as rough as bark. He began to close the door.
"My name is Miriam,"
she said quickly, as if the name itself was a credential.
"I was a nurse, in the war. My husband, he passed, in Kansas. A gunfight. I was on my way to Oregon, to find family."
Her story meant nothing to him. He had heard 100 stories of loss and hardship. They were the common currency of this land. He saw only a problem, a crack in the wall of his solitude. "I've got no room for strangers." He pushed the door further closed, but she put a hand out, her fingers thin and trembling against the wood.
"Please, I can work. I can cook, clean. I won't be a burden."
"No," he said, the word final. He saw the last flicker of hope die in her eyes, replaced by a profound, hollow despair. She let her hand fall from the door. She nodded slowly, a gesture of defeat, and turned away. Eli watched her take 2 faltering steps off the porch before her legs buckled. She crumpled into the snow, a small, dark heap, and did not move. Eli swore under his breath, a sharp, guttural sound of frustration. He stood there for a long moment, the icy wind rushing into his cabin, warring with the warmth from the hearth. He could leave her. Let the snow do its work. It was the law of nature. The weak perished. But as he looked at the still form, an image flashed in his mind. Sarah, lying in the snow after they'd had a playful snowball fight, laughing, her face flushed with life. With another curse, he wrenched the door open and strode out into the cold. He knelt beside the woman, Miriam, and rolled her over. Her face was as white as the snow she lay in, her lips tinged with blue. He felt for a pulse in her neck. It was there, faint and thready. He was angry at her for coming, for being weak, for forcing his hand. He scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and wet wool. He carried her inside and laid her on the rough cot that served as his bed, pulling a coarse wool blanket over her. He closed the door, shutting out the storm, but he knew it was too late. The outside world had found its way in. For the next 2 days, Miriam drifted in and out of consciousness. Eli forced lukewarm broth between her lips and made sure the fire never went out. He did it all with a grim, resentful efficiency. He did not speak to her, even when her eyes fluttered open and looked at him with a dazed confusion. He simply tended to the task at hand, his face set in hard lines. On the third day, she was strong enough to sit up. She thanked him, her voice still weak. He grunted in response, not looking at her. True to her word, as soon as she could stand, she began to make herself useful. She found his meager supplies and made a stew that tasted richer and more savory than anything he'd eaten in years. She swept the floor, tidied the clutter of his solitary life, and washed his few dishes. She moved about the small cabin with a quiet competence that was both impressive and, to Eli, deeply unsettling. He kept his distance. He would take his meals and retreat to a stool in the corner, cleaning his rifle or mending a piece of tack. He answered her questions with single words or not at all. He built a wall of silence between them, a barrier she seemed to understand she should not cross. Yet, her presence changed the cabin. It was warmer, not just from the fire. There was the scent of baking bread now, a smell he hadn't known in a decade. The space felt less like a tomb and more like a home, and he hated it. It was a betrayal of his grief, a softening he could not afford. He treated her with a cold, formal detachment, a landlord to a tenant on a very short lease. The moment the storm broke, she would be gone. A week passed. The snow continued to fall, imprisoning them together. One evening, as the wind howled its most furious song yet, there was another knock at the door. It was sharper this time, more frantic. Eli and Miriam exchanged a look. His was of suspicion, hers of alarm. He rose, taking his rifle from its pegs by the door, and opened it a sliver. A younger woman stood on the porch, her face wild with fear and desperation. Snow clung to her eyelashes and her cloak was torn at the shoulder. She looked past Eli, her eyes locking on Miriam.
Miriam,
She cried, a sob of pure relief in her voice.
thank God, I found you.
Clara, Miriam gasped, pushing past Eli. My dear girl, what are you doing here? How did you find me?
I ran,
The young woman, Clara said, stumbling inside and collapsing into Miriam's arms.
I couldn't stay there another day. He.
She couldn't finish, her body racked with shudders that had nothing to do with the cold. Eli's face was thunderous. His sanctuary had been violated a second time. One was an accident, he bit out, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not running a shelter for wayward women. She can't stay. Miriam turned to him, her eyes pleading.
Eli, please, this is my sister-in-law, Clara, my late husband's younger sister. She has no one else.
I said no, he repeated, his jaw tight, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. His cold tranquility had been shattered, replaced by a simmering rage. This was precisely the kind of entanglement he had sworn to avoid. He was responsible for one life. Grudgingly, he would not be responsible for two.
You don't understand,
Miriam begged.
The place she was working, the man, he was not a good man.
Clara, who had been clinging to Miriam, pulled away. She was younger than Miriam, perhaps in her mid-20s, with fiery red hair that had escaped her hood and eyes the color of moss. Despite her fear, there was a spark of defiance in them. She looked directly at Eli.
I won't be a burden either,
she said, her voice trembling but firm. We will leave as soon as the weather clears. You'll leave now, Eli snarled, gesturing with his head toward the door and the raging blizzard beyond. It was an empty threat, a cruel one, and he knew it. But his fortress was being overrun, and he was lashing out. Clara flinched as if struck, and in that sudden movement, her torn cloak shifted. As she stumbled back against Miriam, the shawl she wore underneath fell away from her shoulders, revealing the back of her simple wool dress. Eli's words died in his throat. The fabric of the dress was dark, but even in the dim light of the cabin, he could see the darker stains and the rips in the cloth. through one of the tears. He saw a glimpse of her skin beneath. It was a canvas of pure agony, a latticework of angry red welts, some already turning a deep, sickening shade of purple, crisscrossed her back. It was the deliberate, vicious pattern left by a belt or a whip. The air went out of the room. Miriam let out a strangled cry and pulled the shawl back around Clara's shoulders. Holding her tight, Clara stood rigid, her face pale, humiliation and pain warring in her eyes. Eli stared, the rifle suddenly heavy in his hands. The anger drained out of him, replaced by something cold and hard and ancient. He had seen marks like that before, on the backs of deserters who had been caught and flogged, on men who had fallen into the hands of cruel overseers. It was the mark of brutal, absolute power wielded over the helpless. He said nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth, the wind moaned outside the window, but inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. He looked from the ugly marks on Clara's back to her defiant, terrified eyes, and then to Miriam's pleading face. He saw two women, widows, cast adrift in a world that had no mercy for them. They were flotsam, and his ranch was the only rock in a raging sea. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned his rifle back against the wall. He turned and threw another thick log onto the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He did not look at them. He just stared into the flames. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any warmth but stripped of its earlier anger. "The stew is on the stove," he said. "Eat. There are extra blankets in the chest." Then he walked past them, retrieved his heavy coat, and went out into the storm to tend to his horse, leaving the two women standing in the fragile, unbelievable warmth of the cabin. He had closed the door behind him, but the lock on his heart had been broken. Two strangers were now inside his walls, and as the snow swirled around him, he had the sinking feeling that the long, cold winter of his soul was about to face a storm of its own. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of profound, suffocating tension. The small cabin, which had felt merely empty to Eli before, now seemed to shrink with the presence of three souls, each carrying the weight of their own unspoken griefs. Eli was the cold, silent center of their universe. He moved through the space as if the two women were ghosts, his eyes looking past them, his body language a fortress of closed-off shoulders and a rigid back. He would rise in the dark, stoke the fire, and be gone before they were fully awake. The sound of his axe splitting wood in the pre-dawn chill the only sign of his existence. He took his meals standing, his back to them, and would retreat to the small, unheated bedroom, his former room, leaving them the relative warmth of the main living space and its hearth. Miriam, with the quiet persistence of a river stone being worn smooth, tried to impose a sense of order and peace on the fragile household. She was the buffer, the negotiator with silence. She rose early to bake bread, filling the cabin with a scent of domesticity that seemed to actively offend Eli. She kept a pot of broth simmering on the hearth, offering him a cup when he came in from the cold, which he would accept with a stiff nod but without a word of thanks. She mended their clothes, swept the floor, and spoke in low, soothing tones, as if any loud noise might shatter the precarious truce they all lived under. She was playing the part of a wife, a homemaker, in a home that wasn't hers, for a man who did not want her there. It was a role she understood. But the emptiness of the gestures in the face of his coldness was a constant, dull ache. Clara was another matter entirely, where Miriam sought to soothe. Clara seemed to chafe against the oppressive quiet. She was fire to Eli's ice. She did not have Miriam's practiced patience or her weary resignation. Having just escaped one form of tyranny, she seemed unwilling to submit to another, even one made of silence. She would meet Eli's stony gaze with a directness that bordered on insolence. When he would grunt a one-word answer to Miriam, Clara would press him with a follow-up question, which he would invariably ignore. Turning his back on her, she did her share of the chores, but with a restless, almost aggressive energy, slamming pots a little too loudly, humming a defiant tune under her breath, It was a small rebellion, a refusal to be rendered invisible by his grief. Her defiance was fueled by a growing, insatiable curiosity. She watched Eli constantly. She watched the way he moved, with the contained power of a predator. She saw the calluses on his hands, the deep scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. A relic of the war, she presumed. She noted the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the two small, snow-covered mounds on the hill, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He was a puzzle, a locked room, and every silent, brooding moment was a challenge to her to find the key. One afternoon, when Eli had taken his rifle and gone out to check his trap lines, Clara began her search. Miriam was kneading dough, her back to her. Clara moved about the cabin, her touch light. She ran her fingers over the rough-hewn mantelpiece, tucked behind a loose stone in the chimney. Her fingers found something. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched. It was smoothed and polished from being held by a small hand, a child's toy. She felt a pang in her chest and quickly put it back, her cheeks flushing as if she had been caught snooping, in a heavy wooden chest that held spare blankets, under a layer that smelled of lavender and disuse. She found a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. It was a portrait of a smiling young woman with kind eyes, and a man who was unmistakably a younger Eli, his face not yet a stone mask, a ghost of a smile on his lips. He was holding a small boy on his lap, a child with his mother's smile and his father's serious brow.
"Leave his things be, Clara,"
Miriam said softly. Not turning around, her voice was gentle but held a note of warning. Clara closed the chest, the click of the latch loud in the quiet room.
"I just want to understand him," she whispered. "What turns a man into that?"
"Loss does," Miriam said, punching the dough with a sudden fierceness. "Loss and war and the hardness of this land. Some people break, some people turn to stone. He chose stone." That evening, as the fire crackled and Eli sat in his corner oiling his rifle, Clara spoke into the silence. "That was your wife and son, wasn't it? In the picture." Eli's hands froze for a fraction of a second. He did not look up. The only sound was the rhythmic squeak of the oilcloth against the steel barrel. Miriam shot Clara a panicked, pleading look, but Clara ignored it. "What were their names?" Clara pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Eli set the rifle down. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to swallow what little light and air was in the room. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his gray eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a pain so profound it was terrifying. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar emptiness. Without a word, he walked to his cold room and shut the door. The sound of the bar sliding into place was like a gunshot. Later that night, with the wind rattling the shutters, Clara and Miriam lay on their makeshift beds near the hearth. "You can't push him like that," Miriam chided gently. "You'll only make it worse." "Why?" Clara retorted, her voice a fierce whisper. "Why must we all tiptoe around his pain? We have our own—" "Did he ask about your husband? Did he ask about the marks on my back? His grief doesn't make him a king." Miriam sighed, the sound full of a weariness that went bone deep. She turned onto her side to face her sister-in-law. "My husband, your brother, was not a good man. Clara, you know that." Clara fell silent. She knew. She had grown up watching her charming, handsome brother, James, slowly crush the life out of the vibrant young woman he had married. "I met him when he was brought into my field hospital near Shiloh," Miriam recounted, her voice distant, her eyes staring into the dancing flames. "He had a piece of shrapnel in his leg. He was so charming. He quoted poetry to me while the surgeon dug the metal out of his flesh. He made me feel beautiful. I thought he was my reward for all the horror I had seen." She paused. In the hospital tents, the pain was honest. A man screamed because his leg was being sawn off. A boy cried for his mother as he died of fever. It was terrible, but it was real. You cleaned the wound, You gave them whiskey for the pain. You held their hand. You knew what you were fighting. She pulled her blanket tighter. The wounds James gave me were different. They were the ones no one could see, the little cruelties, the sharp words that found their mark better than any bullet, the way he would spend all our money on drink and cards, and then smile his handsome smile, and promise it would never happen again. The silence that was worse than his shouting. I was a nurse to dying men, and I had more life in those tents of death than I ever did in my own home with him. She finally looked at Clara, her eyes shining with unshed tears. His death in that gunfight, it was a release. Is it a terrible thing to admit that? That my deepest grief was that I could no longer remember the man I thought I was marrying? Clara reached out and took her hand. No, she said softly. It's not terrible. It's honest. They lay there in silence for a while, two women adrift, finding a small piece of solid ground in each other's shared pain. The blizzard that hit them a few nights later was a monster. It came with a fury that seemed bent on tearing the cabin from its very foundations. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and snow piled in drifts that buried the windows, plunging them into a dim, perpetual twilight. The cold was a physical, malevolent force. It seeped through the chinking in the logs. It crept under the doors, and it turned the far corners of the main room to ice. Eli's bedroom, with no fireplace, became an icebox. That night, for the first time, Eli did not retreat to his room. The cold was simply too dangerous. He brought his blankets out and laid them on the floor on the other side of the hearth, as far from the women as he could get while still being in the small circle of life-giving warmth. The space was impossibly small. The three of them were trapped in an unwilling intimacy, their breathing, their shifting, the small sounds of their bodies all amplified in the roaring silence between the gusts of wind. Miriam lay still, pretending to be asleep. Eli lay on his back, staring up at the dark, smoke-stained rafters. Clara felt a strange, nervous energy coursing through her. She was acutely aware of him, of his presence just a few feet away. She could smell the faint scent of pine smoke, leather, and the cold outdoors that clung to him. The fire burned low, and a deep chill began to settle in the room. Clara shivered, pulling her thin blanket tighter. Eli, without looking at her, reached over and pushed one of his own thick wool blankets toward her side of the hearth. It was a gesture of simple, practical necessity, but it felt like a seismic event. "Thank you," she whispered. He grunted in response, the sound barely audible over the wind. She tentatively reached out and pulled the heavy blanket over her own. It was large enough to be shared. She arranged it so it covered her and then spread the other end over him. He stiffened for a moment, as if to reject it, but the biting cold must have won out, because he allowed it to remain. They lay under the same cover, a universe of silence and sorrow between them, the hearth fire casting flickering shadows on their faces. The wind howled, a lonely, desolate sound, in the deep of the night, lost in a half-dreaming state. Clara shifted. Her hand, seeking warmth, slid out from under her pillow and brushed against his. His hand was large, rough, calloused from years of hard labor. The contact was electric. It was a simple, accidental touch, skin against skin, but in the charged silence of that cabin, it was as loud as a scream. Eli flinched as if he'd been burned. Snatching his hand back, he drew in a sharp breath. Clara pulled her own hand back just as quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay perfectly still, her eyes wide open in the dark, her skin tingling where they had touched. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension that radiated from him. He didn't move for the rest of the night, but she knew he wasn't sleeping. Neither was she. From that night on, something shifted. The touch had broken a seal. Eli's avoidance of Clara became more pointed, more deliberate. He would no longer meet her gaze at all. And if they were in the same small space, he would find a reason to leave. But it was a different kind of avoidance now. It was not born of indifference, but of conflict. Clara would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, a long, searching, almost hungry look. Then he would turn away, a muscle feathering in his jaw, and the wall between them would be higher and colder than ever. He started spending more time at the graves on the hill. Clara would watch from the window as he stood in the blowing snow, a dark, solitary figure. His head bowed. He was wrestling with ghosts, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and frightened her, that she was the cause. He felt guilty. He was a man who had sworn an oath of loyalty to the dead, and his own body, his own nascent feelings, were betraying that oath. He was being drawn to the flame of her defiant life, and it felt like a sacrilege, a sin against the memory of the wife and child he had lost. Miriam saw it all. She had a nurse's eye for subtle symptoms, for the unspoken diagnosis. She saw the way Eli's gaze now followed Clara. She saw the new tension in his shoulders when Clara was near. She saw the small, almost invisible softening in his expression when Clara would laugh at something. And she saw the way Clara seemed to bloom under this silent, conflicted attention, her rebelliousness taking on a new, flirtatious edge. A bitter, unfamiliar emotion began to curdle in Miriam's heart. Jealousy. It was sharp and ugly, and she was ashamed of it. She was the one who was dutiful, the one who cooked and cleaned and tried to make this harsh existence bearable. She was the sensible, capable, older woman. But it was not her that Eli looked at with that torment in his eyes. It was Clara, with her fiery hair and her untamed spirit. Miriam felt herself becoming a shadow in the cabin, the quiet, functional ghost who kept the house warm while life, real, messy, complicated life, was beginning to spark between the other two. She loved Clara, her dear sister-in-law, the only family she had left, but she also envied her. She, too, was a woman. She, too, had a heart that ached with loneliness. One afternoon, as the two women were alone, folding the rough laundry by the fire, the tension between them finally surfaced. "He watches you," Miriam said, her voice flat, her fingers pleating the edge of a wool blanket. Clara stopped her work, her hand still on a rough spun shirt of Eli's. "I know." "And you encourage it." It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Clara looked at her, her expression open, vulnerable. "I don't know what I'm doing. Miriam, he's like a wounded animal. I want to know if he can ever be tamed." "He is a man, not a horse," Miriam said sharply. "And he is a man drowning in grief. You are throwing him a rope, but it may just be to pull him under." She paused, her voice softening. "Or to pull yourself under with him." Clara's face hardened slightly. She looked at Miriam, seeing the weariness, the faint lines of jealousy around her eyes. "If my being here is making things difficult for you, if you want me to go, I will," she said quietly. "I mean it. I can take my chances. I won't come between you and this." She gestured vaguely around the cabin, indicating the fragile sanctuary Miriam had built. It was an offer of profound loyalty, a sacrifice, but Miriam knew it was also a question. "Do you want him for yourself?" Miriam looked away, staring into the fire. The flames danced and writhed, consuming the wood, turning it to ash. She could say yes. She could claim her right as the first one here, the one who had cared for him. She could send Clara out into the wilderness and have this quiet, empty life with this quiet, empty man all to herself. The thought was both tempting and horrifying. But what would she have? A man who looked at her with polite indifference while his soul yearned for another. She would be a caretaker, a housekeeper, just as she had been for years. A nurse to yet another wound she could never heal. She opened her mouth to speak, to tell Clara to stay, that they were sisters, that they would face this together, but the words wouldn't come. The jealousy and the loneliness and the deep, abiding weariness were a knot in her throat. She wanted to claim something for herself, just once, but she also knew it would be a lie. And so, she said nothing. She just kept folding the blanket, her movements precise and mechanical, her face a mask. The silence stretched between them, heavier and more chilling than any winter wind. The silence between the three inhabitants of the cabin had become a living thing, a fourth presence that sat with them at every meal and lay between them in the dark. It was a silence no longer born of mere awkwardness, but of the deep, churning currents of unspoken feelings. Clara's defiant hope, Eli's tormented guilt, and Miriam's rising tide of lonely despair. The fragile peace was predicated on a routine of avoidance and deflection, a careful choreography in a space too small for secrets. It was the land itself, in its infinite and brutal wisdom, that would finally force a reckoning. A false spring arrived in late February. For 3 days, the temperature rose above freezing, and the relentless wind softened to a whisper. The sun, a pale disk in the sky, seemed to regain a measure of its strength. Water began to drip from the eaves of the cabin, a sound so unfamiliar it was startling. The top layer of the vast snowpack began to melt, turning to heavy, wet slush, and the small creek that cut through Eli's lower pasture began to swell, its surface a treacherous skin of rotting ice over a current of frigid, fast-moving water. Eli, ever practical, knew this was a dangerous time. A thaw followed by a hard freeze was nature's cruelest trick. He spent the days securing what was left of his property, checking the roof of the small barn, and ensuring his few animals had solid footing. One of his 2 remaining cows, a hardy Hereford, was heavy with calf, and he watched her with a vigilant eye. He had long since stopped wanting to bring new life onto this cursed land. But the rhythms of nature were indifferent to his wishes. The cold returned on the 3rd night, descending without warning. The temperature plummeted, and the dripping water turned to razor-sharp icicles. The wet slush froze into a solid, unforgiving crust of ice, turning the world into a slick, gray mirror under the moonlight. In the deep of the night, a low, distressed sound from the pasture woke him. It was the cow. Without a word to the sleeping women, Eli pulled on his boots and heavy coat and went out into the frozen darkness, a lantern in his hand. The cow had chosen the worst possible moment and the worst possible place to give birth. She was down by the creek, and her newborn calf, slick and steaming in the frigid air, had slipped and skidded on the new ice, landing in the shallow, fast-moving water. It was trapped, its small hooves finding no purchase on the slippery creek bed, the current pulling at it, the freezing water already stealing its life. The mother cow lowed in frantic, helpless agony. For a moment, Eli just watched. It would be easy to let it go. It was one less mouth to feed, one less thing to care for. It was the way of the wild. But as he watched the small creature struggle, its head barely above the black water, something inside him, a deeply buried instinct of the husbandman, broke through the permafrost of his grief. He could not just stand there and watch it die. Setting the lantern down, he grabbed a length of rope from the barn and waded into the creek. The water was a physical shock, a pure, liquid agony that stole his breath and burned his legs through his thick trousers. The ice broke under his boots, the shards slicing at his skin. He fought the current, reached the terrified calf, and managed to loop the rope around its shivering body. He pulled, his muscles straining, his boots slipping, the icy water churning around his waist. He dragged the animal out of the water and onto the frozen bank, where its mother immediately began to lick it clean, her rough tongue a desperate, life-giving force. Eli stumbled back out of the creek, his entire lower body numb, his teeth chattering so violently he could feel it in his bones. He got the cow and her calf back to the relative warmth of the barn, threw down fresh hay, and then made his way back to the cabin. Every step a monumental effort. He collapsed through the door, dripping and shaking, the sound waking both women. Clara was the first to her feet, her eyes wide with alarm. He managed to strip off his frozen coat and boots before the shaking became uncontrollable. By the time Miriam reached him, he was consumed by a violent, racking chill, his skin an unnatural, waxy white. The roles in the cabin were instantly, irrevocably reversed. The stoic, self-sufficient man was now as helpless as the calf he had just saved. They got him onto his cot by the fire, stripped off his wet clothes, and wrapped him in every dry blanket they could find. But the chill was deep inside him, a core of ice that no fire could seem to touch. By morning, the chill had been replaced by a raging fever. He was burning up, his skin dry and hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was no longer in the cabin in Wyoming. He was lost in a fever dream, a landscape of fractured memories and half-forgotten pains. Miriam, the nurse, took charge. Her movements became crisp, efficient, her voice calm and steady. The weary, jealous woman disappeared, replaced by the professional who knew exactly what to do in the face of death. "Clara, keep the fire hot, but not too hot," she commanded, her hands already grinding herbs in a small bowl. "We need a constant, steady warmth, and keep a pot of snow melting. We'll need all the water we can get." Clara, her fear a hard knot in her stomach, obeyed without question. The two women fell into their own rhythm, a silent partnership forged in crisis. Miriam was the mind, applying poultices of mustard and onion to his chest to clear his lungs, brewing a bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever, her touch firm and impersonal as she checked his pulse, his breathing. Clara was the hands, the constant presence. She sat by his side for hours on end, dipping a rag in cool water and laying it on his forehead, a gesture of simple, human comfort. She held a cup of water to his cracked lips, whispering encouragement when he managed to swallow a few drops. They worked together through the day and into the night, a seamless unit. But in the quiet moments, the rivalry still hummed beneath the surface. Miriam would see the way Clara's hand lingered on his brow, the gentle, almost proprietary way she would brush his sweat-damp hair back from his face, and Clara would see the practiced, knowledgeable way Miriam tended to his body, a clinical intimacy that she could not replicate, and she felt a pang of inadequacy. They were two women fighting for the same life, and perhaps for the same man, in their own disparate ways. The second night was the worst. The fever peaked. Eli began to thrash, his powerful body struggling against the blankets, his voice a low, tormented moan. He was in another time, another place. He spoke of battlefields, of the metallic smell of blood and the screams of dying men. He cried out orders to soldiers long dead. And then, his voice changed. It became softer, younger. "Sarah," he murmured, his eyes, unseeing, staring at the ceiling. "Sarah, the sun's on the meadow. Look at the wildflowers." Clara froze, the wet rag in her hand. Miriam stopped stirring the broth on the fire. They both looked at the man on the cot, feeling like trespassers, eavesdropping on a conversation with a ghost. He was with his wife, in a time before the fire, before the ice had claimed his heart. "I'm sorry," he whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his temple. "I should have been there. I smelled the smoke. I should have been faster." The anguish in his voice was so raw, so pure, it was almost unbearable. He was reliving the worst night of his life, a private hell he had never shared with anyone. Clara felt her own tears welling in her eyes. All the anger she had felt toward his coldness, his silence, dissolved into a profound, aching pity. His fortress was not made of stone, but of unimaginable pain. He grew agitated again, his hands reaching for something that wasn't there. "Sarah, don't leave!" His voice broke. Clara, acting on pure instinct, reached out and took his hand. It was burning hot, but his fingers weakly closed around hers. The contact seemed to soothe him. His thrashing subsided, his breathing evening out slightly. Miriam watched the scene from across the room, her face impassive, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Clara sat with him like that for a long time, his hand in hers. The fire crackled, the wind whispered outside, and the man she had thought was made of granite slowly revealed the broken pieces of his heart. As the night deepened, he grew quiet. His fevered gaze shifted and seemed to focus on her face. Though she knew he wasn't truly seeing her, he was looking at her, but seeing someone else. Or perhaps seeing both of them at once, the past and present blurring in his delirious mind. His lips moved, and he whispered, his voice a dry, desperate rasp. The words meant only for her. "Don't leave me again." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Again. He wasn't just talking to the ghost of his wife. He was talking to her. He was afraid she, too, would leave him alone in the silence. In that moment, all the ambiguity, all the tension, all the unasked questions fell away. She saw only a man, terrified and alone, pleading for her to stay. Her heart swelled with a feeling so powerful it almost choked her, a fierce, protective tenderness. She leaned down, her fiery hair brushing against his cheek. She gently freed her hand and used it to cup his face. She pressed her lips to his hot, dry forehead. A soft, lingering kiss that was a promise, a vow. It was not a kiss of passion, but of pure, unadulterated compassion. A sacrament offered in the dead of night to a tormented soul. "I won't," she whispered back. "I'm here." She sat by his side for the rest of the night, watching him, a solitary vigil as Miriam finally retreated to her own blankets, turning her back to them both. The fever broke just before dawn. His temperature dropped. The violent shivering ceased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. When he finally woke in the late afternoon, the delirium was gone. His eyes were clear. They were still the color of a winter sky, but the storm had passed. He looked around the cabin, his gaze taking in the evidence of his illness. The bowl of herbs, the extra blankets, the pot of broth. His eyes fell on Miriam, who was quietly mending a shirt. He gave a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of her care. Then, his gaze found Clara, who was sitting on a stool near the fire. He looked at her, and she saw that the man who had looked back at her before the fever was gone. The hard, defensive shell had been burned away, leaving him raw and exposed. There was no coldness in his eyes now, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. And something else, a gentle, questioning vulnerability. It was a look of recognition, as if he were seeing her, truly seeing her, for the very first time. He remembered. He remembered her touch, her voice cutting through the fog of his pain. He said nothing, but his eyes held hers, and in that silent gaze, a new understanding passed between them, an intimacy forged in the crucible of fever and fear. Miriam saw it. She saw the look that passed between them. It was quiet. It was subtle, but it was as definitive as a signed contract. It was the look of two people who had found a connection in a place she could not enter. She had been the nurse, the one who had methodically and skillfully saved his physical body. But Clara had been the one to touch his soul. A cold, sharp pain, more bitter than any jealousy she had felt before, pierced her heart. She was, and always would be, on the outside. That night, after the men were fed and the chores were done, Miriam found she couldn't breathe in the small, charged atmosphere of the cabin. She pulled on her coat and boots and slipped outside. The air was frigid and sharp, but it was clean. The moon was high and full, illuminating the landscape in a stark, ethereal light, the ice on the trees glittering like a million tiny diamonds. It was beautiful, but she felt none of it. She walked to the edge of the woods, to a large, snow-dusted oak tree that stood like a silent sentinel. She leaned her forehead against its rough, frozen bark, and she finally let herself break. The sobs came from a place deep inside her, a place she had kept locked away for years. They were silent, racking shudders that shook her entire body. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She wept for her foolish, broken marriage. She wept for the dying boys she had nursed, for the life she had lost. She wept for her own loneliness, a void so vast and profound it felt like it would swallow her whole. And she wept because she had seen that look in Eli's eyes, and she knew, with a final, heartbreaking certainty, that she would never be the one to put that light there. She stayed out in the cold until she was numb, until there were no tears left to cry. When she returned to the cabin, her face was calm, her resolve as hard and clear as the ice on the branches. The next day, Eli was strong enough to sit up by the fire, sipping a bowl of broth. Miriam waited until Clara had gone out to the barn to check on the new calf. She stood before him, her hands clasped in front of her. "Eli," she said, her voice even and steady, "I am grateful for your shelter. You saved my life." He looked up at her, his expression serious. He had his voice back, though it was raspy. "You saved mine." She gave a small, sad smile. "When the winter breaks and the passes are clear, I will be leaving," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. "I'll continue on to Oregon. I'll find my family." Eli looked at her for a long time. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but words had never been his currency. He was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he slowly reached beside his cot for a small bundle. He held it out to her. It was a pair of women's gloves, beautifully crafted from soft deerskin. The stitching along the seams was small and perfect, clearly done by a patient and skilled hand. He had mended a tear in the palm of one and replaced a worn section of the thumb on the other. The new leather a slightly lighter shade than the old. They were practical, warm, and sturdy. He didn't say, "Don't go." He didn't say, "Stay." He just held out the gloves. A silent, humble offering. It was his way of saying thank you. It was his way of saying he cared if her hands were warm on her journey. It was an acknowledgement of everything she had done, and everything she was. It was the most eloquent speech he had ever made. The wake of Eli's fever was a strange, fragile country. The oppressive tension that had defined their existence had not vanished, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer a cold war of silence and resentment, but a quiet, watchful stillness, humming with the electricity of things unsaid and feelings unearthed. Eli, still weak but regaining his strength, was a different man. The fever had acted as a crucible, melting away the outer layers of ice and stone to reveal the raw, grieving man beneath. He spoke more, not in long speeches, but in small phrases of thanks, in observations about the weather, in questions about the new calf. Each word felt like a stone being carefully placed to build a bridge across a chasm. Miriam received his gratitude with a quiet, sad dignity. She had accepted his gift of the mended gloves and had placed them carefully in her small satchel, a symbol of a future she had already decided upon. She moved through her days with a new, heartbreaking grace, a woman already practicing her own departure. She was kind, she was efficient, but she had walled off a part of herself. She would not allow herself to hope, and in doing so, she created a small, polite distance between herself and the other two. This distance, this careful retreat by Miriam, created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, Eli and Clara were drawn. They found themselves in a new kind of intimacy, one born in the fever-soaked darkness of the sick room. Their conversations were quiet, hesitant. He would ask her about her life before she came here, and she would tell him, skirting the darkest parts but revealing enough for him to understand the landscape of her own losses. She, in turn, learned to read the nuances of his silence, to see the flicker of memory in his eyes when he looked at the hills, to understand that his gruffness was a shield, not a sword. The accidental touch in the night had been a spark. The fever had been the kindling. Now, in the aftermath, a slow, dangerous fire was beginning to burn. One evening, the air in the cabin was thick with it. They had finished a simple meal of rabbit stew and fresh bread. Miriam, pleading a headache, had retreated to her cot and turned her face to the wall, a clear signal that she wished to be left alone. It left Eli and Clara at the small table, the remnants of their dinner between them, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls.
"I'll clean up,"
Clara said softly, rising and gathering the plates. Eli rose too.
"I'll help."
It was a simple offer, but it was a world away from the man who had eaten his meals standing and alone just weeks before. They moved to the wash basin, a small space by the hearth. Clara poured hot water from the kettle into the basin, the steam rising to mist her face and catch in her red hair like a halo. She washed, and he stood beside her, taking the clean plates and drying them with a piece of sacking. Their hands brushed as she passed him a bowl. It was a fleeting contact, but it stopped them both. The air crackled. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the low moan of the wind outside. Clara looked up at him, her green eyes wide and searching in the firelight. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw no ghosts in his eyes, no shadows of his past. He was looking only at her. His gaze was intense, full of a decade of starvation, a hunger for life, for warmth, for contact that he had denied for so long. He slowly raised a hand, his rough, calloused fingers trembling slightly, and gently touched her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. He half expected to be struck by a bolt of lightning, to be punished by the heavens for this betrayal of his vow. But there was only the impossible softness of her skin, the clean scent of soap and wood smoke, the sight of her lips, slightly parted. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was a clear and total surrender. It was all the invitation he needed. He lowered his head, and she raised hers, and their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision of loneliness and longing, a desperate affirmation of life in a world defined by death. It was the taste of salt from her skin and the faint hint of stew on his lips. It was the roughness of his unshaven jaw against her cheek, and the surprising softness of his mouth. He tangled a hand in her hair, pulling her closer, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. They kissed for a long time, a deep, searching kiss that spoke of all the words they had never said. It was a kiss of shared sorrow and nascent hope, a raw and honest expression of two broken people finding a piece of solace in each other. The fire burned hot and red beside them, a reflection of the inferno that had finally broken free inside them both. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They did not speak. There were no words for what had just happened, for the line that had been crossed. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name, and held out his hand. She took it without hesitation. Her hand was small in his, but she gripped it tightly. In silence, he led her away from the fire, past the still, silent form of Miriam on her cot, and into the small, cold room that had been his solitary fortress. He pushed the door closed, and in the darkness, they let the emotions that had been simmering for weeks finally, completely, take hold. The next morning, the world was remade. A weak sun filtered through the grimy window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Miriam was already awake. She had been awake most of the night, lying on her cot, her back to the room, listening to the silence that was louder than any storm. She had not heard Clara return to her bed. She had known, with the grim certainty of a prophet, where she was. She was stoking the fire, her movements stiff and brittle, when she heard the soft click of Eli's bedroom door. She did not turn. She kept her eyes fixed on the flames, her face a rigid mask. Clara emerged from the room, her clothes rumpled, her hair a wild tangle of red. She stopped when she saw Miriam, her steps faltering. Her face, which should have been flushed with the glow of a new love, was pale and etched with a profound, soul-deep guilt. Her eyes were full of a desperate, pleading remorse. Miriam finally turned, her body moving as if it were one solid, angry piece. She looked at Clara, a long, cold look that stripped away every pretense, every excuse. She saw not just the woman who had spent the night with the man she herself had come to care for, but a symbol of her own failure, her own invisibility. In that moment, all the unspoken jealousy, all the quiet suffering, all the weary resignation of the past weeks coalesced into a single, diamond-hard point of rage. Without a word, Miriam turned from the fire and strode to her small satchel. She began to pack, her movements jerky and furious. She folded her spare dress, her hands pulling the fabric taut with a vicious energy. She gathered her small pouch of herbs, her Bible, the mended gloves Eli had given her. Each item was a testament to the life she had tried to build here, a life that had just been stolen from her. She pulled on her worn coat and her boots, her intention clear and absolute. She was leaving.
"Miriam, no,"
Clara whispered, her voice choked.
"Don't, please."
Miriam ignored her, tying her shawl around her head, her fingers fumbling with a knot in her anger. She marched to the cabin door and threw it open. A blast of frigid air and swirling snow filled the room. The brief thaw was long over. The world outside was a white, howling wilderness. To venture out into it was suicide.
"Miriam, you can't,"
Clara cried, running to her and grabbing her arm.
"You'll die out there."
Miriam ripped her arm away, her eyes blazing with a cold fire Clara had never seen before.
"Let me go,"
she hissed.
"I would rather die out there than stay in here for one more minute."
She took a step out onto the porch, but Clara grabbed her again, this time throwing her arms around her, holding on with a desperate strength. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, freezing in the brutal wind.
"I'm sorry,"
she sobbed, her words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and anguish.
"Miriam, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. Oh, God, you have to believe me. I've never been loved like that."
The confession was a raw, bleeding wound. It spoke of a lifetime of being used and abused, of a desperate hunger for a tenderness she had never known. The words stopped Miriam in her tracks. But Clara wasn't finished.
"But if you go,"
she wailed, her voice breaking.
"if you leave because of me, I won't be able to live with myself. I can't bear it. It will feel like I've betrayed the only family I have left."
Just then, the bedroom door opened again, and Eli emerged, pulling on his shirt. He took in the scene at the open door, the frigid wind, the two women clinging to each other, one in rage, the other in despair. His face, which had held a new softness just moments before, hardened with the realization of the devastation he had caused. He strode toward them, his boots thudding on the floorboards.
"Miriam,"
he said, his voice rough.
"Don't go. This is my fault."
Miriam rounded on him, her grief and rage finally finding its true target.
"Your fault?"
she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You hide in your silence for weeks, a ghost in your own home. And then you do this?"
"I didn't know what to do,"
he said, his voice low, agonized. He looked from Miriam's furious face to Clara's tear-streaked one. He finally spoke the truth that he had kept locked away, the truth that had festered in the silence.
I had feelings for you both."
The confession hung in the frozen air, stunning both women into silence.
"For you."
"Miriam," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "I saw a strength I hadn't seen since Sarah. You brought order, you brought warmth, you cared for me. You were a comfort, a safe harbor." He then turned his eyes to Clara. "And in you, Clara, I saw life, a fire. You challenged me, you pushed me. You made me feel something other than grief for the first time in 10 years. He looked between them, his face a mask of torment.
"I didn't know how to choose. I didn't feel I had the right to choose. I was afraid of hurting one of you, of hurting you both, and so I said nothing. And my silence has done more harm than any words ever could have."
It was an honest, brutal, and clumsy confession. the words of a man who had forgotten the language of the heart. For a moment, Miriam just stared at him, her chest heaving. He had cared for her, he had seen her, and he had chosen Clara anyway. The pain of it was a physical blow. All the tension, all the heartbreak, all the fury inside her snapped. With a guttural cry, she launched herself at him, her hand striking him across the face with a loud, sharp crack. The force of it staggered him. The imprint of her hand stood out, stark and red, against his pale skin. The violence seemed to drain the last of the fight out of her. The rage vanished, replaced by a wave of pure, bottomless despair. She let out a choked sob and turned. Collapsing into Clara's arms, she clung to her sister-in-law, the woman who had both betrayed her and was now her only anchor, and wept. She cried until she had no strength left, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. And then her legs gave out. She went limp, a dead weight in Clara's arms, and crumpled to the snowy floor of the porch, a small, broken heap. The sight of her, so utterly defeated, broke through their shock. Eli and Clara acted as one. Eli scooped her up, his face grim, the red mark on his cheek a brand of his failure. Clara scrambled ahead of them, shutting the door against the howling wind and throwing more logs on the fire. They laid Miriam on the cot, her body limp and cold. They worked together, their movements swift and silent, to pull off her wet boots and coat. They wrapped her in the warmest, driest blankets, and chafed her icy hands between their own. She was unresponsive, lost in a place of shock and grief where they could not reach her. Finally, there was nothing left to do. The three of them, the man and the two women, sat by the hearth, Eli on a stool, Clara on the floor by Miriam's cot, her hand resting on Miriam's blanket-wrapped form. The fire crackled and spat, a warm, living thing in the center of the cold. Dead silence. Everything had been said, everything had been broken, and as the snow continued to fall outside, they sat together in the ruins, with no idea how to even begin to build again. The silence that fell in the wake of Miriam's collapse was a physical entity, a thick, smothering blanket of guilt and fear. The cold from the porch seemed to have followed her inside, clinging to her clothes and skin, a malevolent presence that the roaring fire could not entirely banish. Eli and Clara worked in a desperate, silent tandem, their previous conflict forgotten, their shared transgression now a shared burden of responsibility. By nightfall, it was clear that the chill had taken root deep inside Miriam. The initial icy coldness gave way to a shivering that shook the very cot she lay on, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that rattled her teeth and made her moan softly in her unconscious state. By morning, the shivering had stopped, replaced by its opposite, a dry, searing heat. Her skin was hot to the touch, her cheeks flushed with a feverish, unnatural red against the waxy pallor of her face. Her breathing became a shallow, rasping sound in the quiet cabin. She was, as Eli had been, lost to them, adrift on the turbulent seas of a fever dream. The irony was not lost on either Eli or Clara. The roles were now perfectly, cruelly reversed. Miriam, the stoic and capable nurse who had pulled Eli back from the brink, was now the patient. And they, the two people whose actions had driven her out into the deadly cold, were now her sole caretakers. Guilt was a poor substitute for medical knowledge, but it was a powerful motivator. "We do what she did for you," Clara said, her voice a raw whisper. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a steely resolve. The guilt had burned away her defiance, leaving behind a fierce, protective core. "The willow bark tea for the fever, the cool cloths. We have to keep her warm, but not let her overheat." Eli nodded, his face grim. The red mark on his cheek had faded to a dull purple, a constant, physical reminder of his failure. He felt a helplessness that was almost as debilitating as his own recent illness. He was a man of action, of axes and rifles and ropes. He knew how to fight the tangible threats of the wilderness. But this invisible enemy, this fever born of heartbreak and cold, was a different kind of beast. He could only follow Clara's lead, his movements clumsy with shame. They fell into a grueling, round-the-clock vigil. It was a strange penance, performed in the intimate space of the sick room. Eli took on the heavy, practical tasks. He kept the fire fed with a meticulous, obsessive focus, ensuring a constant, even heat. He chopped a hole in the thick ice of the creek to fetch buckets of fresh, frigid water. He brewed the bitter willow bark tea, his large, rough hands surprisingly steady as he measured out the dried flakes. He did it all with a grim, relentless efficiency, his silence no longer one of withdrawal, but of intense, focused atonement. Clara became the constant presence at Miriam's side. She was the one who bathed Miriam's face and wrists with cool water, her touch infinitely gentle. She was the one who tried to force spoonfuls of lukewarm broth and tea between Miriam's cracked, dry lips, whispering words of encouragement, her voice low and soothing. She sat for hours, simply holding Miriam's hot, restless hand, as if she could anchor her to the world through her touch alone. They barely spoke to each other. Their communication was a series of gestures and shared glances across the cot. A nod from Clara, and Eli would put another log on the fire, a questioning look from him, and she would shake her head, indicating Miriam's condition was unchanged. In this shared, desperate task, the raw, painful edges of their new relationship began to soften. The guilt of their passion was overshadowed by the urgency of their shared purpose. They were no longer two people who had stolen a moment for themselves. They were partners in a fight for a life that was precious to them both. As the fever raged, Miriam began to talk. Like Eli, she was lost in the labyrinth of her past, her words a jumbled, heartbreaking tapestry of memory and pain. She spoke of the war, of the endless rows of cots, of the scent of gangrene and the sound of men crying for their mothers. She called out names, issued orders to long-dead orderlies, her voice imbued with a nurse's crisp authority, even in her delirium. But then the fragments shifted. Her voice would soften, becoming that of a younger woman, full of a hope that was painful to hear. She spoke to her husband, James, pleading with him not to go to the saloon, promising him a good dinner. Her words a portrait of 1,000 small, lonely battles she had lost. And then her wanderings brought her to the present, to the cabin, to the core of her pain. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a thread of pure, raw agony that cut through the quiet room. "There's no room," she murmured, her head thrashing on the pillow. "Always, the one on the outside, the extra one." Clara, who was wiping her brow, froze. Eli, standing by the fire, went rigid. They were being forced to listen to the uncensored truth of her heart. "He looks at her," Miriam whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "Of course he does. She's fire. I'm just the hearth, useful, but cold when the fire goes out." A tear escaped from under her eyelid and traced a path down her temple. "I need to be loved, too," she pleaded to the empty air, her voice cracking with a lifetime of unspoken need. "I don't want to be the surplus one. Not again. Please, I just want to be loved." The words were a dagger in Clara's heart. She looked up at Eli, her own eyes swimming with tears. His face was a mask of pure anguish. He looked like a man being flayed alive. This was the true cost of his silence, of their stolen night. It was not just a moment of betrayal. It was the final confirmation of a fear Miriam had carried her entire life, that she was not worthy of being chosen, that she was destined to be the one left behind. Clara's guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but it was quickly consumed by a wave of fierce, protective love. She saw not a rival, but the woman who had been her only true family, her sister in all but blood, lying broken and in agony. She leaned down close to Miriam's ear, her own tears falling onto the pillow. "Miriam," she whispered, her voice thick but firm. "Listen to me. You are not the surplus one.
You are not the extra one. You are everything. She gently brushed the damp hair from Miriam's forehead and pressed her lips there in a soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss of fealty, of sisterhood, of profound love. I will never leave you, she vowed, the words a sacred promise made in the crucible of that sick room. You will never be alone again, I swear it. Miriam's restless thrashing seemed to ease at the sound of her voice, at the touch of her lips. She sank into a deeper, less troubled state of unconsciousness, as if the promise had been a balm that could reach her even in the depths of the fever. Clara stayed there, her hand on Miriam's cheek, until her own tears had dried, leaving her with a strange and fragile sense of clarity. The fever broke 2 days later, leaving Miriam as weak and helpless as a newborn, but alive. Her recovery was slow, measured in spoonfuls of broth and the first few faltering steps from the cot to a chair by the fire. The atmosphere in the cabin during her convalescence was one of immense, fragile tenderness. The rage was gone. The guilt, while still present, was no longer a destructive force, but a quiet, shared knowledge that bound them together. Eli and Clara tended to her with a devotion that was both an apology and a promise. As Miriam's strength returned, a new question began to hang in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. What now? Miriam's plan to leave for Oregon felt like a relic from another lifetime. The fragile, complicated ecosystem they had created seemed too interwoven to simply tear apart. But the alternative seemed impossible, a flagrant violation of every rule of God and man. It was Clara who finally gave the impossible a voice. One afternoon, about a week after the fever had broken, the three of them were sitting by the fire. Miriam was propped up with pillows in the chair. Eli was mending a piece of harness, and Clara was darning a sock. The silence was comfortable, easy, for the first time. Clara set down her sewing. She looked from Miriam's pale, thoughtful face to Eli's bent, focused head, and she took a breath. I have been thinking, she began, her voice quiet but clear, commanding their attention, about what happens when the snow melts. Miriam's gaze flickered toward her satchel, where the mended gloves lay waiting. Eli's hands stilled their work. Miriam, you talk of going to Oregon, Clara continued, and I suppose I don't know what I would do, but the thought of us separating, after all this, it feels wrong. It feels like a defeat. She looked directly at Miriam, her eyes full of a fierce, earnest love. When I was a girl, I dreamed of having a home. Not just a house, but a place where I was safe, and where the people I loved were safe. A place where no one was the surplus one. She then shifted her gaze to Eli. And I think you, in your own way, have been searching for the same thing. She paused, gathering her courage. What if this is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What if this is home for all of us? The proposal was so radical, so far outside the bounds of their world, that it was breathtaking. Eli looked up, his face a mask of pure astonishment. Miriam stared at her, her lips slightly parted in disbelief. What are you saying, Clara? Miriam asked, her voice faint. I am saying, Clara said, her courage growing, that I love you both, in different ways. Yes, but the love is real, and I believe you both have come to care for each other, and for me, we have been a disaster, but we have also been a refuge. We have hurt each other, but we have also healed each other. Why should the rules of a world that has been so cruel to all of us be the rules that we live by here? She finally laid her heart bare. I am proposing that we stay together, the three of us, that we make a family here, on our own terms, a home where no one is left out in the cold, a place where everyone is chosen. She looked from Eli's stunned face to Miriam's incredulous one. If you will have it, if you will have us. The silence that followed was profound. Eli looked at the two women. He looked at Miriam,
who had nursed him back to life and whose quiet strength was the bedrock of this cabin. He looked at Clara, whose fiery spirit had reawakened his own will to live, whose compassion had just saved them all from a different kind of death. He thought of the 10 years he had spent alone, honoring the dead by walling himself off from the living. He saw now that his solitude had not been an honor, but a different kind of fire, one that had slowly turned his heart to ash. He looked at these two women, and he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that to send either of them away would be the final, unforgivable sin. It would be an act of abandonment, the very thing he had spent a decade mourning. He knew, in that moment, that no one deserved to be left behind. Miriam looked at Clara, her fierce, loyal, beautiful sister-in-law, offering her a place at the very center of the home, not as a guest or a dependent, but as an equal. She looked at Eli, his face stripped of all its defenses, his eyes full of a hope so fragile it was heartbreaking, and she felt the cold knot of her lifelong loneliness finally, blessedly, begin to dissolve. A slow smile touched Miriam's lips. It was a watery, hesitant thing, but it was real. She reached out a hand to Clara. "You foolish, wonderful girl," she whispered. The decision was made, not in a torrent of words, but in a shared look, a clasped hand, a silent acknowledgement of a truth that was more powerful than any convention. That night, as a fresh, heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white, the three of them came together. It was not a decision spoken aloud, but a slow, gravitational pull. After the fire was banked, Eli did not go to his cold room alone. He stood before them, his hand outstretched, an open invitation, in the warm, fire-lit heart of the cabin, which had once been Eli's solitary bedroom but was now the warmest and safest part of the house. They created a new world. It was a night of impossible tenderness. It was a night filled with the quiet awe of discovery, of desires long suppressed, of a comfort so profound it was almost painful. It was Miriam, held and cherished, her skin touched with a reverence that had nothing to do with duty. It was Clara, giving and receiving affection without the shadow of guilt, her passion a celebration, not a sin. It was Eli, allowing himself to receive warmth and life from two sources, finally understanding that a heart, however broken, could learn to grow again in new and unexpected ways. They moved with a slow, careful grace, learning the contours of a new kind of love, a new definition of family. In the flickering firelight, their three bodies, their three souls, intertwined. They left all their grief, all their guilt, all the harsh judgments of the outside world, on the other side of the door, buried and silenced by the falling snow. The first sign of the great thaw was not a sight, but a sound. For months, the world had been defined by the sharp, brittle noises of a frozen existence, the crack of an axe in the frigid air, the squeak of boots on packed snow, the howl of the wind. Then one morning in early April, a new sound entered their lives, the soft, persistent drip, drip, drip of water falling from the cabin's eaves. It was a gentle, melodic rhythm, the world's own heartbeat slowly starting again. Soon, the signs were everywhere. The snow, which had been a monolithic, blinding white, began to recede from the base of the trees, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. The southern-facing slopes of the hills were the first to surrender, emerging in great muddy patches that steamed in the pale afternoon sun. The creek, which had been a solid sheet of gray ice, began to groan and crack, the sound like distant thunder, as the current beneath gathered strength and broke its winter prison. The air itself changed. It lost its sharp, sterile bite and became thick with the scent of wet soil, of pine needles releasing their fragrance, of life stirring in its sleep. For the three people in the cabin, this slow, inexorable turning of the season was a reflection of the thaw that had taken place within their own hearts. The brutal winter of their solitude and grief was finally, blessedly, coming to an end. With the melting of the snow came the re-emergence of the world beyond their isolated ranch. The road to the small settlement of Dusty, a 2-day ride away, became passable again. They were running low on essentials: salt, flour, coffee, kerosene, and a trip was unavoidable. It was decided that Eli would go. The night before he was to leave, a quiet anxiety settled over the cabin. It would be the first time they had been separated since the night of the great blizzard. "Be safe," Miriam said, handing him a parcel of journey bread she had baked. Her voice was steady, but her hands lingered on the parcel for a moment longer than necessary. Clara stood by the door, her arms wrapped around herself. "The ground will be soft," she said, her practical words a thin veil for her worry. "Don't push the horse too hard." Eli looked at them, at their two concerned faces lit by the firelight, and a feeling he had not known in over a decade washed over him. The feeling of having something to come home to. It was a feeling so potent, it was almost painful. He simply nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll be back in 4 days." His journey to town was uneventful, but his time in it was a stark reminder of the world they had left behind. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he felt the eyes on him. He had been a near hermit for years, but his infrequent visits had always been met with a kind of gruff, frontier respect. He was a man who had suffered a great loss and kept to himself. They had understood that. But now, the looks he received were different. They were laced with a sly, knowing curiosity, with the glint of salacious gossip. Word, it seemed, had traveled. A lone trapper, passing by his lands a few weeks prior, must have seen the smoke from the chimney and perhaps a glimpse of a woman's skirt, and had carried the tale to town. The story would have grown with each telling, twisted into a scandalous narrative of a grieving widower and 2 mysterious women. Inside the store, the proprietor, a man named Henderson, whom Eli had known for years, served him with a clipped, cool efficiency. The usual friendly banter was gone. A few men loitering by the pot-bellied stove fell silent when he entered, their conversation only resuming in low, guttural whispers as he gathered his supplies. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight on his shoulders. He heard a half-snickered comment from one of the men. "Keeps himself warm through the winter, it seems." The old Eli, the man of stone and ice, would have reacted with a cold, simmering rage. He would have turned, his eyes flat and dangerous, and the men would have backed down, silenced by the palpable threat of violence. But as he stood there, the flour sack heavy in his arms, he didn't feel anger. He felt a strange sense of detachment. He thought of the cabin. He thought of Miriam, her steady hands kneading dough, her calm voice reading aloud in the evenings. He thought of Clara, her fiery hair catching the light, her laughter, a sound that had become as essential to him as breathing. Their life, the one they had forged in the crucible of winter, was real. It was warm and complicated and true. This place, with its small-minded whispers and its narrow, rigid rules, suddenly seemed like a ghost world, a place of shadows and echoes. Their judgment had no power over him because they were judging a life they could not possibly comprehend. He paid for his goods, loaded them onto his horse, and rode out of town without a backward glance. He was no longer a part of their world. His world was waiting for him at the ranch to the north, in a small cabin that held everything he cared about. When he returned, the relief in the cabin was a palpable thing. Clara ran from the barn to meet him, her face alight with a joy that made his heart ache. Miriam met him at the door, her smile a quiet benediction. That night, as they sat together, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air, he told them about the whispers, the cold shoulders. Miriam sighed, a flicker of old sadness in her eyes. "I expected as much." Clara's chin lifted in defiance.
"Let them whisper,"
she said, her voice full of fire.
"Their words can't hurt us here."
Eli looked at her, and then at Miriam, and he knew she was right. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "They can't." And so, they turned their backs on the world and poured their energy into their own. Spring exploded across the land with a fierce, untamed beauty. The drab, muddy ground gave way to a carpet of vibrant green, and the hillsides became a tapestry of wildflowers, bluebells, Indian paintbrush, and sunny yellow buttercups. This new life outside was mirrored by the life they were building together. They started a garden in a protected patch of land behind the cabin. It was Miriam's domain, but Clara was her most eager student. They worked side by side, their hands in the rich, dark soil, planting seeds for beans, squash, and potatoes. They would talk for hours as they worked, their conversations a gentle meandering of past memories and future hopes. Eli would watch them from the barn. These two women, one with the quiet wisdom of a river, the other with the vibrant energy of a flame, creating a place of sustenance and beauty from the barren ground. The ranch itself began to live again. The old, half-collapsed section of the barn, damaged by years of neglect and heavy snows, became their next project. Eli, with his strength and knowledge of carpentry, was the architect and builder, but he was not alone. Miriam and Clara worked alongside him, hauling timber, handing him tools, their presence a constant source of support and encouragement. There was an easy rhythm to their work, punctuated by shared meals under the warm spring sun, and the occasional burst of laughter when one of them would miss a nail or trip over a loose board. They were not just rebuilding a barn, they were rebuilding a life, a future, beam by beam. Their evenings took on a new, sacred quality. After the hard work of the day, they would gather by the fire. Miriam, whose eyesight was the keenest, would often read aloud to them from the Bible or the tattered copy of Shakespeare she had carried with her from Kansas. Her voice was a calm, steady anchor in the vast, wild silence of the prairie. They were a strange congregation, these three broken people, finding solace and a sense of shared humanity in the words of poets and prophets. Their physical intimacy, which had been born in a night of desperate, raw emotion, deepened and evolved. It was no longer about a feverish need to banish loneliness, but about a daily, tender reaffirmation of their bond. It was in the small gestures, the way Clara would lay her head on Miriam's shoulder as she read, the way Eli would gently massage Miriam's tired hands after a long day in the garden, the way a simple, shared glance between the three of them could convey a universe of love and understanding. They were charting a new territory of the heart, a place for which there were no maps, and they were doing it with a quiet, fearless grace. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of dusky rose and pale lavender, they sat together on the newly repaired porch steps. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming sage. A sense of deep, peaceful exhaustion settled over them. They had spent the day setting the final rafters on the new barn roof. Miriam sat between the other two. She looked out at the land, at the hills bathed in the soft, fading light. She then looked at her companions, at Clara, leaning against her. Her fiery spirit softened into a gentle glow. At Eli, his strong profile outlined against the sky, his face no longer a mask of stone but a testament to the resilience of the human heart. She felt a wave of love for them so powerful, so profound, it filled her to bursting. She reached out, taking Clara's hand in her left and Eli's in her right. She held them tightly, her touch a bridge between them. "I have been thinking," she said, her voice soft but clear in the stillness, "about what the world would call us, what they would call me." She paused, her gaze steady. "I want you to know, I have no need of a name. I don't need to be called a wife." Her words hung in the air, a statement of radical, unconditional love. "All those years," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "I thought that was what I wanted, a title, a place, to belong to someone. But I was wrong. I don't need to belong to anyone. I just need to belong with you. As long as we are together, right here, like this, that is all the name I will ever need."
Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed Miriam's hand. Eli turned to look at Miriam, his gray eyes full of a deep, quiet reverence. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles, a gesture of profound respect and acceptance. In the days that followed, Eli was often quiet, disappearing into the woods for hours at a time. When he returned, he would have small pieces of wood in his hands. He spent the evenings by the fire, after the women had gone to bed, carving with a small, sharp knife. He worked with an intense, patient focus, the shavings falling like soft snow around his boots. A week later, on a morning so bright and clear it felt like the first day of creation, he presented his work. He came to them as they were staking the bean plants in the garden. He held out his hands, and on his rough palms lay 2 bracelets. They were carved from the heartwood of a sturdy oak, the wood a rich, warm brown, polished to a smooth, soft sheen. They were simple, elegant loops, perfectly sized. He had not carved flowers or hearts into them. Instead, he had carved the grain of the wood itself, following its natural lines, a testament to the beauty of strength and endurance. He took Miriam's hand and slid one of the bracelets onto her wrist. Then he took Clara's and did the same. They were not wedding rings, symbols of ownership and law. They were circles of oak, symbols of a bond that was as strong, as natural, and as enduring as the trees from which they came. It was his answer, his vow, spoken in the only language he truly knew. The story ends here, but it also begins here. It begins on a sun-drenched afternoon, with the last of the snow long gone, and the wildflowers blooming in a riot of color on the hill where the 2 small graves lay. The hill was no longer just a place of memory and sorrow. It was a place of life, a testament to the fact that even in the soil of the deepest grief, beauty can and will grow again. The 3 of them walked up that hill, their work for the day done. They stood for a moment, looking out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that was their home. Then, Eli reached out his hand to Clara, and she took it. Clara reached for Miriam's hand, and she took it. And they stood there, the 3 of them, hand in hand. A family forged in the heart of a brutal winter. They were an unrecognized family. A story that would only be told in whispers by a world that could not understand it. But they didn't need the world's recognition. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Here, in the wild heart of the West, surrounded by the ghosts of what they had lost and the vibrant promise of what they had built, they had found their final, truest refuge. They had found it in each other. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your thoughts.